we don't gain moral authority by being perfect. We gain moral authority by recognizing that there's forgiveness for those mistakes, but we have to continue to move forward. And what can we do every day of our lives to make the world a better place? And that's really what this is about.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Leadership Syllabus. I'm your series host and leadership performance coach, Jamal JImerson. The Leadership Syllabus podcast provides insights from leaders on the main leadership lesson they've learned from their work, life, and experiences, and who they are as a person. Each 30-minute mod will capture a bit about who the guest is, their work, and the one lesson they would contribute to the Leadership Syllabus. The collection of mods will offer you a one-series stop of real-world and life lessons to enhance your own self-understanding, awareness, and effectiveness in leadership and life. And today's mod is Moral Leadership, and today's contributor is Jamal JImerson. And Jamal is a Brooklyn-born educator, coach, and leadership strategist who partners with nonprofits and purpose-driven organizations to strengthen leadership, equity, and impact. He is the co-founder, chief innovation officer, and mission coach of North Star Partners, drawing on more than 20 years in nonprofit leadership, including founding the Minority Inclusion Project, and Thought Partner Solutions. He's completing his doctorate in educational leadership and organizational innovation, studying how moral conviction, shared values, and character helps leaders sustain diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments under pressure. Very timely conversation, Jamal. And I interviewed Jay years ago. We were just talking about it. It was on a previous series that I no longer do. And I want to bring Jamal back for my other series, the book leads, just because I think he provides some amazing insights. That conversation was, I think at this point, maybe 7.5 years ago. I remember it was during the summer. I think it was in 2018. So just great work you're doing, great insights you provide, great community builder. I love everything that you're doing, Jay. So thank you so much for coming on to this series.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Anytime, my friend. So Jamal, I know you, I read the bio, but how would you describe yourself? Who are you as a person?
Yeah, it's interesting because every time someone reads the bio, the first thing I do is I go, okay, that's all great and everything, but here's what you really need to know, right? What you really need to know is that first and foremost, I see myself as a dad. I have two beautiful teenagers that I've been raising in this world, and frankly, they've been a lot of the inspiration. I call them my board of directors. They've been the inspiration behind a lot of my movement work over the last 20 years. So the kids have really been the center. I'm also a husband. I have an amazing partner, and we are in this purpose-driven work together. And I would also say, if I was describing myself in things that really matter to me, is that I'm a man of faith. I walk with my Christianity, and I've learned how to integrate my faith into leadership. And so that's been a big part of who I've been and what I represent. But I wasn't always this clear. I really, just in the last 5 years, became very clear on the purpose and the reason why I'm here and why I'm here to do this type of work. And it's why I've kind of pivoted my messaging in the last 5 years to really focus on moral and values-based leadership.
It's incredible how I met you before that 5-year period you're talking about, right? You're saying last 5 years, back to 2020. I met you in 2017. We spoke on that series at that time, 2018. And even then, I knew you had purpose. I knew you had drive. I knew what you were about. But it's amazing how even you knowing all that, having all that, you reach a certain point where it kind of levels up.
Yeah.
Because something happens, something calls on you. So as impressive as your work was back then, it's incredible to think that you're saying that even in the last 5 years, you've really been called into who you're supposed to be.
Yeah. It was, I've always been just for background context, I've always been someone who's been, a part of activist movements, organized movements. And I always had my faith, and these were all kind of separate ideas. And leading into the period coming into 2020, we were in the heart of racial justice, racial equity, and DEI movement. And I had already been actively a part of that for most of my young adults and adult kind of progression in my career. So I'd always had some role in that. But I think what shook me to the core was really trying to, one, I kind of crossed over to a deeper relationship with my faith. I really took a big step in 2020. But the other part of it was just looking at the overall movement and realizing that it was moving in a direction where it was becoming too much about division and the inability to have civil discourse, and it was too much side taking, and I felt conflicted in that because that isn't what I came into it for. That plus my journey into my faith, and then I think in 2023, my father passed away. My father was he was a professor, he was a sociologist, he was an educator.
I
He was
remember
some
you
of those.
telling me about him years
Yeah,
ago, like how many
yeah,
books he'd written and all that, right?
yeah,
Like it was
yeah. I mean,
like
the
dozens
guy,
of books, right?
amazing, dozens of books that he's written, and and he wrote them from a place of, when you talk about someone who's purpose driven, this was not, he wasn't going out to big publishers and getting millions of dollars for these books. I mean, these books were bringing in some royalties for him, but it wasn't a lot, and so, but he did this because he believed in educating people. He was passionate about trying to change the world. He was a social justice warrior, and he did that by integrating both his faith and his principles around social justice. So when he passed in 2023, that was like, it was an interesting period because I went into a bit of a transformative haze, I like to call it. And in that process, that's when I started to realize that I had to center myself. I had to kind of figure out a way to bring it all together. And it was right there. It was the line of my faith. It was my passion around my values, and specifically those related to DEI and racial justice. And it was being able to teach and to use
Yeah,
the thing that God's put me here to do, which is to educate. And so if I could bring those together and bring that to the nonprofit sector, I felt like that would be really helpful. And
that's
that's where it got
beautiful.
started.
That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Like I said, just how impressive your work was before, and just to know that that's leveled up because
Yeah.
of,
Thank you.
circumstances, it's unbelievable. Jamal, how would you, again, went through the bio, but can you walk me through a little bit of your work, what that looks
Yeah.
like, how you decided to pivot into those areas?
Yeah. So much of my work prior to about maybe 2023 was really, I had spent a lot of my time working in nonprofits. I had been in leadership in nonprofits, and had been, blessed with some really great opportunities. And then, as you mentioned earlier in the bio, around 2015, 2016, I decided to address the lack of board diversity in nonprofits. So in doing that, I realized that I couldn't continue just sort of operating. And one of the things that I think has, kind of been placed on my spirit that I've learned, wasn't from me, but it kind of came from my faith, was really like that I'm not here to be inside the box. Like everything, when I really do a survey of my life and I look at the way I've lived, I think that I've been put here to go outside the box, to always try to find new ways to do things, to innovate, to try different ways of doing things. And so for so many years, I was operating inside the sort of systemic structure of the nonprofit world, the nonprofit industrial complex, as we call it. And when I started MIP, it was kind of stepping away from that. But MIP was a nonprofit, and it was designed to help other nonprofits. It was like, okay, let's come in and try to find a way to support y'all. And then from there, graduated into, I started doing some consulting work. And I realized that, I had to carry all these different bags, but really it was about trying to get the core message I was trying to get across was getting organizations to really strategically implement their DEI work, like make it a pivotal thing. I realized in 2023, though, after having worked with literally, when I tell you hundreds of organizations, thousands of nonprofit board leaders, executive directors. I mean, I've done, dozens of speaking engagements. I mean, there's been a lot that I've done. I realized that the question that kept coming up with a lot of these folks was like, how do you implement? How do you implement? And I realized the answer is right there, right? Like we've already given you the answer time and time again, but for some reason people keep asking how, right? So that was the first thing that really stood out to me. And the second thing that really resonated with me was when the political, when Trump arrived, when he came in with sort of like this push towards anti wokeness. What was interesting to me was how quickly retrenchment started, how quickly organizations really started to run, and frankly, just on the threat, on the idea that they would have their funding challenged, or or some of the
Hmm.
social and cultural backlash, they literally ran. And so that made me question it, because it was like, we're not talking about strategy here. We're not talking about the ability to just, sort of implement a thing. We're talking about, what is it at your core that made you say, okay, I'm going to walk away from something. Was it ever real for you in the first place? And
Yeah.
another like big inspiration for me, John, just to kind of highlight this point, is around 2022, 2023. I want to say somewhere around 2023, I read this book by Jonathan Eeg that was done on Dr. King. And historically, I've always been a big, like I love Dr. King, but I love Malcolm X even more. Like I'm more of like a, throw your fist up, speak truth to power, like that kind of energy. But this was the first book that I've read about Dr. King. I've read many, right? Really essays, books, other things. But this is the first book I've read about Dr. King that to me gave me a comprehensive overview of his life, but also established this thing in him, this moral compass in him that was just different. And the example of that was that he came from the South to go to school in the North at various points. And so at one particular point where he was coming up here to do his studies, he had to take a train from the South. And that train, he started out in Georgia or Atlanta, wherever it was. And he started on that train in the back, right? Because of the whites only, color only kind of
Yeah.
segregation. He arrived in or around DC, the DC area, and the restrictions were lifted because Jim Crow no longer applied. So he was able to move to the front of the train. He then comes up north, and we know that he spent time in the Boston area. He spent time in Connecticut. I mean, he's been all up in this area doing his studies. He even spent some time in Pennsylvania in like Quaker country. I mean, this guy had some real great experiences. What's really interesting, John, is that he was at a point where he was doing so well up north. He had a life up north. He was established up north. He didn't have to go back to the South to put himself in the heart of the civil rights movement. He literally, or at the forefront rather, right? He could have stayed where he was, but there was a calling on him. There was something that was in him that would not allow him to just stay in the space where he was safe and to allow this movement to go on without him. He knew he was going back into the belly of the beast, and he made the decision to do that anyway. And there's something really powerful about that type of decision that for me was a catalyst for me to say, okay, you know what, if this man, and as great as he was, could walk into the belly of the beast and choose the life he chose, what makes someone do that? And
After having already left the beast,
right,
he went
right,
back in and then went
right,
into the belly of it.
right,
Yeah.
right. So, and then that's the part I think of the story that we oftentimes don't hear about the fact that, we hear about Dr. King coming up in the South. What we don't realize is that he actually got out and went back. He got a taste of the good life, right? He got to see an environment that to him wasn't structurally racist when he was up here. I mean, granted, there was still racism in existence, but in his mind, it was like, okay, this is totally different than what I'm experiencing in the South. And for him to get back on that train and go back down there and to go back to his calling and to go back to that church and preach and do all those things when he knew that there was so much that was, at stake. That says a lot about what it means to have a strong moral compass. So that's really where the final push for me came from. And it was like, you know what, if, we've got to look at this through a moral lens, and in the face of the opposition, we've got to really, get firm and establish our roots.
Jamal, so we're learning, and we're limited on time, but we're learning, where the fire in you comes from.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Aside from the list of questions that I have for the series, I am curious, what is it that you've taken away from your work?
Yeah.
Before any leadership lesson, what's the general lesson, insight that you've taken from the work that you're doing?
Yeah, in my current time, I think what I'm really walking away with is that my work is my calling, and so I used to separate the work from everything else. And I thought like, I'm purpose driven, but I'm passionate and all these other things. And I separated it from my faith, and I'm realizing that they're intertwined.
Yeah.
My service to God is literally through my leadership. And so I know that there's a theory around this called servant leadership that really kind of brings this to the forefront, this idea that real leadership is the way it was laid out in the Bible, right? Is that essentially Jesus is the servant leader, and that the rest of us are sort of extensions of that. And I subscribe to that, but I also subscribe to the idea that it's not enough just to identify with it in terms of role. It's really important to live it and practice, and that's where the focus on morals comes from. So for me, it's even in the construct of what is essentially a consultancy at this point, and the work that I'm doing with all of these different nonprofits and the leaders in these spaces. My focus is on the calling. I know that I've been called to this, that I'm operating in purpose, and so that informs every interaction, every training, every coaching session, every strategy session that I have with them, as I'm informed by that moral compass. And so that's been a huge part of the journey for me, is learning that.
So you've touched upon morality, kind of how it plays into leadership. The next question is, what does that look like when you try to apply that, when you try to guide somebody, when you try to get somebody to question their moral leadership? What does that look like when it's in play in your work? Because
You know,
obviously the mod title is moral leadership, so we'll get
mhm.
into the action steps that people can take for that.
Oh yeah,
But what does that look like in your
yeah.
work? Because
You,
it's slightly different from other ideas or constructs of what leadership brings to the
yeah,
workplace. When you talk about moral leadership, what does
yeah.
that look like on the ground for you?
It's interesting because leadership, broadly, when you look at it through like sort of a large umbrella lens, when you get into leadership development, a lot of it involves like deep introspection and assessment. It's really, stepping back and really looking at yourself, right? The moral leadership construct is really just designed to do that through the lens of your morals, your beliefs, and your values. And so instead of looking at your leadership through, and there have been theories that have been based around leadership being defined as how you interact with folks and, leader follower exchange and how authentic you are, how charismatic you are, and those kind of different leadership traits, are you transformational? Those to me are, if you think of a tree, those are essentially the fruit, right? That's the fruit of the tree. What we're really getting at, and what I believe that moral leadership is designed to do, is to get at the root, is to really try to understand, where does your leadership fruit come from and how did you get there? And so that when, if you think of a tree, the root is really the thing that keeps the tree standing, right? And so when you are faced with adversity, opposition, the winds, the water, the waves, they're going to come, right? The question is, are you rooted solidly so that you can withstand some of those challenges? And so the construct of moral leadership is not to judge, right? Like, so one of the things I'm really big on is I don't come in with the lens for trying to tell someone what their morals should be, as much as it is trying to get them to identify with what their moral compass is, and then asking the questions and having them do some self-diagnosis to really figure out, like, am I in alignment? Are my morals and my values aligned? Because this is really more about alignment than it is about, like, the clarity and the alignment of your morals
Mm.
with your practice, than it is about necessarily having a moral framework that I check off. Like, I don't need everyone to be, Jesus per se. I need folks to really tap into what it is that they believe is right and wrong. And then ultimately, how is that showing up in your value system? How's that then showing up in your behaviors and your practice and in your policies and all the other fruit that come from your tree?
How have people reacted to that aspect of it?
I am shocked at the reaction. I'm actually shocked. I really, John, honestly, I'm a super like geeky, nerdy, sort of like, but very humble cat. Like, I don't really hold a lot of like oversized thoughts of myself. The response to the framework and the discussions that I've had so far has been, what I've received is so refreshing from folks. Like, they're happy to see that there's someone coming in, bringing in an elevated conversation. And it's not that moral leadership is new. It's that what I'm doing is I'm bringing it to the forefront, especially of a sector that is in the process of going through some deep retrenchment around some of the things they say they value because
Yeah.
of systemic pressure. And I'm saying to them, like, look, before we just perform, right? Let's talk about who we are first. Let's get to the root. I found that conversations around morals and values in boardrooms and amongst leadership teams seems to get people to really have a better understanding of each other, and it's helping to address that discourse problem when I talked about like the division, because this is there's arguments on the at the fruit level about politics and who's Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. I'm really not interested in starting there. My main thing is to start at the thing that unifies us, and more often than not, you will find that your values and your morals do have some unifying constructs to them. So people seem to be really responsive, John. They seem to be really open. I just did a conference recently where our attendance at the conference, we had standing room only in my workshop, which was really great. And again, I think it's not me. It's that people are excited to have a framework presented that challenges the status quo in a
Yeah.
way that uses words like love and says love is a strategy. It's a
Mm.
part of your core strategy. And they go,
Yeah.
that sounds soft. And then you end up helping folks to understand how love can be a fuel
Yeah.
for an effective leader. So these kind of things, but yeah, really positive reception.
So when it comes to, I mean, obviously you're talking leadership, you're talking in boardrooms and companies, but obviously anybody can use these kind of lessons in their life, whether
Oh
they
yeah,
want to use it in their personal life or their work life. So what kind of calls to action or what kind of action steps would you suggest to people when it comes to moral leadership, how to look at it, how
yeah.
to assess it in their own lives and the way
Yeah.
that they carry themselves.
Yeah. So one of the things that I built was a framework called a true north leadership model. And the premise there is to look at what I believe are the four critical components of a moral leader, and then how that advances your work. And so I think in any place in your life, these four components can come in. So for one, there's your moral compass. So knowing what is your North Star? What is the thing that really drives you? What's your true north? And so part of it is really getting tapped into that and really examining who you are. And in a time of high chaos, when things are really demanding, when the pressure is on, that's when your morals and your values are most tested. They're not tested when things are great. For the most part, you're good. But when you're challenged, that's when your morals and your values come out or have an opportunity to be tested. And so your moral compass is an opportunity for you to sort of identify, these are the things that I hold that are really important to me. The second part of it, I would say, is moral courage, right? So the other piece of it is, then once you've identified with what your compass is and what your stated morals are, is really tapping in and finding the courage to stand for what you believe in. And that's for all of us. I mean, we're all, like, again, this goes back to the Dr. King example of it wasn't just that he had this moral compass. He literally got back on the train and went back down south and went back into the belly of the beast. And that says a lot.
Yeah.
But you have to have a level of courage in order to do that. The third piece would be, I would refer to it as congruence. And essentially it's alignment. So it's, now I'm courageous and I know my compass, but are my actions aligned with my morals? Are my values aligned? Am I doing, like, if you looked at my behaviors and you use that as a metric of, this is what my value system is, or this is what my morals are, would they be aligned? And if they're not consistent, then that's the work, is getting that alignment back. And then finally, I would say, is moral resilience. And resilience is key, John, like, because again, the storms, the wind, the waves will come. The question is, are you willing to stand in the battle and stand for what you believe in? And this is, in the nonprofit sector, for example, a perfect example of this is the threats around funding. You have organizations that I know of, leaders who I know of, who have walked away from millions of dollars because they are standing for what they believe in related to DEI. They refuse to fold. You have others that have retrenched. Now, this is not a judgment of those organizations or the leaders.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the retrenchment in their mind is due to a practical reason. Like, look, if you're taking funding, now you're taking us off our mission. We can't serve the people we serve. And so now we have to make a choice. But that's the complexity of dealing with morals, right?
Oh,
Is,
yeah.
again, when the pressure comes and there's a choice between choosing what is morally right and what is morally righteous or aligned with what you believe and what you're going to do, that's when that's your opportunity to put your morals in action. And so what that means is that we need more creativity, more operational and strategic creativity when we are morally congruent and morally courageous and morally resilient, because we need to be able to figure out ways to still operate without necessarily folding every time the pressure comes down. And I would say in your personal life as a leader, knowing those factors, knowing your compass, your courage, being able to tap into your congruence and making sure you're aligned and being resilient is going to be key to carrying you in any leadership decision that you're making.
One thing I want you to speak to, just because I think all of what you're sharing is applicable to what we're seeing now.
Mm-hmm.
I think in life, we go through the motions. We operate. If we're not intentional, if we're not
Mm-hmm.
proactive
Right.
About what we want, we operate
Right.
in fear because
Yeah.
we're kind of just coasting and we're afraid that other people are going to take what we have. Whereas if we look at what we have and study who we are, we know where we stand, we're a little more confident. We don't quite have as much fear. I think that's the biggest piece, is fear today.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think most of us, it's not clean cut, but most of us want the same things out of life. But
Yeah.
it's that fear of scarcity that somebody's going to take something I have.
Yeah.
So can you, before we run out of time, can you speak a
Yeah.
little bit to fear and how that plays into,
Yeah.
I mean, you've spoken about companies retrenching because they're afraid of
Yeah.
losing funding, and it impacts people down the line.
Yeah.
But in a greater sense in
Yeah.
society, fear versus that
Yeah.
moral leadership.
Yeah, fear drives anxiety, it drives worry, it drives depression, right? And we've all been there. I've had my struggles with it, and I think we see more and more mental health issues that come up as a result of really what at the root is a fear, all right? And it's, to your point, the fear of scarcity, the fear of loss, and ultimately the fear of losing the thing that we call life. For this question in particular, I would say that this is why I believe strongly, and I stand by this, that every leader's moral compass has to be connected somehow to some type of a higher power, a belief in something that's bigger. My particular example of how I address my fear is with faith in God. I address my fear through a faith in my relationship with God, my relationship with Jesus. I do not uh, like like every other person, I struggle, right, with decisions that I'm making on a day-to-day basis. But oftentimes I have to find my way through that struggle with and my conviction through prayer, and through my relationship with the Lord. And that is important to me, right? And but I think that every leader, like a framework for that we're talking about, still has to be rooted in something that addresses that fear.
Yeah.
And I believe that the core way to address it at the root is some type of a system of faith. And the question that we all have to ask ourselves is, what is your faith in? Because if your faith is in your works and in your performance, then you're always going to be in a space of anxiety because you're never going to feel like you're doing enough.
Yeah.
But if your faith is in the one who says that, you're here as a vessel and you're being used for a purpose, and I got you, just do what you're supposed to do, then if you trust in him, then that's when you're going to see your outcomes. And so I live that, right? And I have to practice that every day myself. And that's the heartbeat of the encouragement that I would give other folks in this space. I believe that leaders need their faith as much as they need their monetary resources, their political contacts, their social contacts, and so forth. Faith has to be at the core of it.
I mean, it really is stand for something or you'll fall for anything.
Exactly. Exactly.
Jay, is there anything else you want to share about your work, this topic, the mod title, moral leadership, anything that I might not have asked? We're coming up on time soon, but anything else you want to
Mhm.
add? Anything at
Yeah, I
all?
just think that, like, I want to stress that the thing I've learned about because I used to struggle with the word moral. I struggled with it. I struggled with it. I thought it was a little bit presumptuous. I thought it was outside of the realm of what I had the authority to even use. Like, how can you talk about moral leadership? Who gave you the moral authority? And what I've
Yeah.
learned over the years is that moral authority comes through humility. It comes through the process of engaging in a humble way, again, with your faith, with your leadership, with the people that you are in service to. Like, I see myself as being in service, right? And so even this podcast to me is an opportunity for me to serve through what I'm doing. I'm not, looking for the return. I'm looking for the service, for the input. And so
Yeah.
that's where your sort of moral authority, that's where the word moral kind of comes in at. But I've struggled with that. And I want to say to anyone who might hear that word and think, okay, well, what does that mean for my life? This is not about positioning yourself in a particularly higher way than others. In fact, the call out of moral leadership is to recognize your purpose in serving others, and to really be and be okay with that and be all right with that. And that's what gives you moral authority. That's what gave Christ his moral authority, was that he was here. His entire life was built around service, and he gave us the greatest gift that we've ever gotten. So
Yeah. And, if you're watching this on video, the reason that I'm smiling is because I was curious about that. I didn't know quite how to place the question,
yeah,
but when you were going to come in to share moral leadership, I'm like, all right, how does that fall into what we say and we think about as people who are kind of preaching to others
yeah,
that have the moral high ground and they claim it and that's it.
yeah,
But you tied it up beautifully by saying this plays into humility. So this isn't just a position of power. It's
yeah,
strength, but it's not trying to overpower anybody.
yeah,
I love that you brought up humility because I think that's another piece that's missing entirely from today's
yeah.
conversations.
And also is one thing I want to stress too, is that moral leadership is not perfection. And
Yeah,
they're very different concepts. In fact, in order to really become a good moral leader, I think you have to be willing to be open and vulnerable about your own mistakes. And for those of us
absolutely.
who've made many, many mistakes in the journey, we don't gain moral authority by being perfect. We gain moral authority by recognizing that there's forgiveness for those mistakes, but we have to continue to move forward. And what can we do every day of our lives to make the world a better place? And that's really what this is about.
Amen, Jay.
Thank you.
Brother, thank you so much for being here. You'll be on the other series with me. Thank you for sitting down for this one.
Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. If there's anything I might have missed, let me know. There's so much to cover, limited time based on this series and the 30 minutes we want to get through the mod. But thank you to everybody for watching, listening, and subscribing. Reach out if you do have those questions, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.